Good evening. Welcome to the final in our Black History Month lecture series. You're going to hear tonight about Black history in the military. But before we do that, I want to share something with you. The Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs has created a new award. It's called the Trailblazer Award. And when you hear about the recipient tonight, you'll understand why we created this award. So I want to talk about Brigadier General Chris Walker. Brigadier General Christopher Walker is the Chief of Staff for the West Virginia Air National Guard. The West Virginia Air National Guard has over 2,000 members and consists of 2 mobility air forces, the 130th Airlift Wing in Charleston, West Virginia, and the 167th Airlift Wing in Martinsburg, West Virginia. As Chief of Staff, he is the Deputy Commander of the West Virginia Air National Guard and provides command and control over the headquarters and staff. He supervises the preparation of plans, policies, and programs for the Air National Guard. Units assigned to the state and advises and assists the Adjutant General in their execution. General Walker's current federal dual assignment is Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Manpower and Reserve Affairs, providing oversight and input concerning laws, regulations, and policies of the human capital portfolio to ensure mission success. In this role, General Walker assists in the areas of diversity, force development, force management, total force, and an airman and family readiness. Born in New York City, New York, General Walker began his Air Force career in 1988, graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. After undergraduate navigator training at Mather Air Force Base in 1989, he served as a C-130 navigator in weather reconnaissance and tactical airlift squadrons throughout the world, including an assignment as an airdrop planner in the Balkans Combined Air Operations Center in Vicenza, Italy, and flying in various contingencies including Operations Provide, Promise, Provide Comfort, and Provide Relief. In 1997, General Walker left active duty to join the Air National Guard and served as C-130H-3 Evaluator Navigator, and has commanded the squadron and group level. He served in various operations and contingencies such as OEF, OIF, Joint Guard, Joint Forge, and Boland Oak, Coronet Oak. He has served as a special assistant to the Director of Mobility Forces at the 609th Combined Air Operations Center in Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar, and also he served as Civil Aviation Advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Transportation with the Coalition Provisional Authority. He has served as the Air National Guard Crisis Action Team Director, acting as Mobility Division Chief at the 609th Combined Air Operations Center, and Air National Guard Deputy Director of Air, Space, and Information Operations. General Walker is a master navigator with over 5,200 hours in WC-130 and C-130E, H, H-3 aircraft, including over 400 combat and combat support hours. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in General Engineering from the United States Air Force Academy. He has received numerous major awards and decorations, including Meritorious Service Medal with 4 Oak Leaf Clusters and Air Force Commendation Medal with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters. Last year, Walker made history as the first African American promoted to the rank of general in the West Virginia National Guard. This year, General Walker made history again as the first African American to become commander of the West Virginia Air National Guard. And tonight, he becomes the first recipient of the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs Trailblazer Award. Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Christopher S. Walker.
So by using the term trailblazer means that I'm blazing the trail, and I need you all, everyone in here, I need your help in finding me intrepid, smart, and stout, and brave, and willing to serve men and women, young women, men and women. Send them to serve with the West Virginia Air National Guard. I promise I will take good care of them, and they will know how to lead after being under my aegis. And if they want to go to active duty Air Force, we'll wait for them to come do their time in active duty and come and rejoin us here in the West Virginia Air National Guard. But again, I'll need all of your help. We're going to reach into the schools, we're going to reach into the churches, and show the parents that we will take good care of their sons and daughters. And I give you that promise, I give you that vow. Trailblazer means there's a trail for other youngsters to follow, and I need you to help me get those youngsters. Thank you so much.
And now on to our lecture. So presenting tonight for Black History in the Military is Charles T. Ledbetter, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army retired. Born, raised, and educated through his high school years in Muskogee, Oklahoma, Lieutenant Colonel Charles T. Ledbetter has been blessed with 3 careers. After graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology with a minor in music from Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, he served as an officer in the United States Army for slightly over 20 years. Colonel Ledbetter's assignments were in the following career fields: missiles, air defense, artillery, infantry, Army Special Forces, Green Berets, Foreign Area Specialists, Middle East Specialist Advisor, Personnel Management Administration, Adjutant General Corps, and Education ROTC. Colonel Ledbetter is a combat veteran of the Vietnam War and was stationed at a number of Army installations across the United States and overseas. During his 20-year career, Colonel Ledbetter received the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, Meritorious Service Medal with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Air Medal Joint Services Commendation Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Army Commendation Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, National Defense Service Medal, Vietnam Service Medal, Army Service Medal, Overseas Service Medal, Vietnam Campaign Medal, Presidential Unit Citation, Meritorious Unit Citation, and the Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm. Colonel Ledbetter also earned a variety of badges over the course of his career, to include the Combat Infantryman Badge, U.S. Parachutist Badge, and the Special Forces Tab, Vietnamese Parachutist Badge, the Expert Missile Man's Badge, and the Expert Rifleman's Badge. Throughout his life, Colonel Ledbetter has had an insatiable thirst for knowledge, which has led to his earning a master's degree in public administration with a minor in business from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. Securing a Missouri Lifetime Teaching Certification in Social Studies by completing 30 hours of master level work in education at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and receiving a PhD in education with a minor in counseling from Kent State University. Additionally, Colonel Ledbetter completed the Executive Leadership and Management Institute at Stanford University in Stanford, California. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Charles T. Ledbetter.
Good afternoon. When I sent them that bio, I said, please don't use all of this. They ask you to send them something, and you have to do that. I hope that I will say something today that will be beneficial and useful and informative, and that you'll get something out of it. I'm going to try to see if you can hear me without the mic. I'm not, as a professor, used to standing behind a podium, so I'm going to try it. If I can't, then I'll constantly use this. I see some faces. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
You can? No problem. Okay, if I start to talk and you don't hear, just raise your hand and I'll go back to the mic. Okay? Good enough. This is the framework that I'm going to attempt to use in trying to cover the subject that I've been asked to cover in terms of blacks in the military, the history of blacks in the military. And why am I breaking it up into these areas? Well, we're talking about from 1775 to 2019. How do you cover 243 years of the history of blacks in the military in 1 hour? I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do that. In addition to that constraint, there are 12 branches. So not only do I have the years, but I also have 12 military branches that if I were really covering the history, I'd have to go through each one of those. And again, my question then is, how do we cover 12 branches in 1 hour? So I'm going to try to look at it in a different way. And I'm hoping that what I will end up giving you is a framework that you can use to learn more about blacks in the military. And I'm going to try to use that framework to just explain some of the things that have gone on with blacks in the military since 1775. So to fully understand the history, we're going to try to break it down into these areas, understanding the geographical position of the nation at any particular time. The characteristics and beliefs of the culture of the people who lived in the nation at any particular time, as we're talking about blacks in the military. And then, of course, the question is, how do I cover all of that in 1 hour as well? Of course, it can't be done in that form, in any depth. So again, I go back to the format that I intend to use in trying to cover it with this time frame. So let's get started. We're going to talk about 6 recurring factors that I think are important if you're going to look at blacks in the military and have any understanding of how things have gone for those 243 years. First factor, looking at that geographical, demographic, economic factor that comes into play. And I'm going to start with the Revolutionary War in trying to explain how this can be used as a way of understanding the subject. First, we've got to start with what led to the war. When we look back at this period, and we talk about our history as a country, and you look at what this part of the North American continent looked like, what you find are those areas in red were under the British. Those would have been the colonies that we talk about. But in addition to those colonies, also existed the area controlled by France, the area controlled by Spain, as well as the Native Americans that were also here at the time. In this 1800 century period, in this time frame, there were 3 major wars that took place with the British. And those 3 wars cost the British an awful lot of money. Trying to conduct these wars, in addition to having fighting other nations on the European continent, trying to fight wars here on this continent as well was quite a task and quite expensive. And as you may recall from your American history, one of the problems they incurred then was that they needed money. And one way of getting money then was to tax the colonies. And they came up with these various taxes. Well, needless to say, many of the people in the colonies didn't like that. They liked the protection they were getting from the British, but they didn't like to be taxed to help pay for that protection. And so there were some uprisings that occurred. And again, looking at the change that had occurred in this area of North America after the British had taken the land away from the French at that particular point, 1775. What were the demographics in the colonies when the Continental Army was formed? Let's take a look at it. There were about 2,500,000 people who lived in the colonies from European ancestry, and about 500,000 people who were of African descent. So a total of about 3 million people total in what we call the British colonies at that point. About 53% of those people who lived in the colonies were of British descent, ethnic background, or approximately 1.5 million. About 9% were of German ethnicity. And of course, these individuals had no loyalty to the British at all. About 7% were of Scottish-Irish descent. About 5% fell into these other categories. So sometimes when we think about who was living here, we often think of everybody being British, of British descent, and all very supportive of this uprising that was about to take place, which wasn't the case at all. And one of the reasons it wasn't, as you can see, is because people came from a variety of different areas. About 4% Dutch, 2% French, and about 20% were of African descent, the second largest percentage to the British. And as I indicate here, about 4% of those individuals were free people of African descent. One of the things, again, we often don't think about in our culture and in the history books, when we put everybody into that category of being African or African descent, is that there were as many, in fact more, people of different ethnic backgrounds in Africa than there were in Europe. And so when people were brought here as slaves, they came from all these different ethnic backgrounds. They had different cultures, they spoke different languages, they had different religions, and so they were just as different, even though they fell under this category, as we still put people under, African, as the people who came here from Europe. And they had to find a way to communicate and to learn, to get together, and to form a culture here. In fact, even today, it's more diverse in Africa than it is any other place in terms of ethnicity, language, color of skin, DNA. There are a variety of ways that people became free, and I wanted to just touch on that as well, because again, it points out some of the differences in the people who we tend to put under one category. Free blacks. And most of it's been documented through the records that have been available in places like churches and wills and deeds and so forth, as to how these individuals became free blacks. One was in this case of indentured servants. There were a number of people who came here as indentured servants from Africa. Not everybody came as a slave. Then there were people who were free because of the unions between white women and African males. Because in those days, one took on the freedom based upon the sex. And if in fact one was born to an African, for example, what we might call a African American today, if they're born to a person whose mother was white, then they were free under the law. That didn't occur if in fact the father of that person was white. Then they became a slave. Also, they were, in fact, often freed by the slave owners because many times the people who were inheriting the slaves didn't want to continue slavery or continue to have people as slaves, and they freed them. We mentioned the mistress situation, and there was a period of time when evangelists from especially the Methodist and Baptist churches were going around trying to convert as many people from Africa into becoming Christians, because again, they came from a variety of different religions. And those that they converted to Christianity often gained their freedom through their conversion to Christianity. And again, the reason I point this out is to show the diversity that existed in the colonies in 1775. So we don't come away again, or leave this session anyway, believing that everybody was for the war with the British. And you can see why there wasn't that consensus. In fact, only about 45% at the most supported the war against the British. This was a breakdown of the population of those colonies. And again, in that time frame, about 90% of the individuals lived in rural areas. And if you can imagine, we didn't have Facebook and all these other things that we have today to communicate with. So if you lived in these rural areas, you had very little contact with other people in terms of ways of communicating. It would take months to get a letter sometimes to someone, or a note to someone. Couldn't pick up a phone, they didn't exist. You see. These were the colonies that existed in this time frame when the trouble started with the taxes. And when the First Continental Congress met to talk about how do we deal with the British who are now taxing us to try to pay for these wars. How do we do this? Congress had a problem. They had to decide on what to do. Well, their decision was to form a military. It had these battles in Lexington and so forth. And when they formed the Second Continental Congress to try to come up with a way of solving this, they decided then to, in fact, form a military to take on the British. And again, remember, there wasn't 100% support for it. Only a very small percentage of people in the colonies actually supported their efforts. Had no legal authority to do what they were doing. They had no money. They didn't have a majority support. But they did it anyway. Can anybody tell me what the official date is of the United States Army? Do we don't have any Army vets in here? June 14th, 1775. Official starting date, accepted date for the birth of the United States Army. They voted to raise 10 companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia to get it started. Washington was appointed the commander 1 month later, or next day, I'm sorry, took over as the commander for it. And they tasked the colonies then to come up with the troops to man this particular army. Now remember, we don't have support in all these colonies for doing what they're asking them to do. And we have people who are, for the most part, living in rural areas. How do you get to them? You just gave a recruiting speech a few minutes ago. They didn't have mics and audiences where you could do that. So now they've got the task of how do you get them? We soon formed two other groups. October 13, 1775, the Navy. And November the 12th, 1775, the Marine Corps. So we've got the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps in this year, all being formed to help fight this war against the British. I've given you, I think, the answer to this one. About 45% of the colonies supported the war. About 20% were loyal to the British. Many of them, in fact, fought with the British. We don't often talk about that, but they did. Others left, went back to wherever they came from, or went some other place where they wouldn't be touched by those who were trying to force them into the military. And 35% supported neither group. So clearly, again, there weren't the majority of the people supporting this effort. We talked about the 13 colonies, and often we forget another group that was also a part of this. Can anybody tell me what the 14th colony was that participated in the war? No? West Virginia, long ways off before West Virginia. Anybody? Vermont was not considered one of the original 13 colonies. And in fact, it declared itself an independent state during this time frame and did fight with the 13 colonies, but not as one of the 13 colonies and a part of the Continental Congress and so forth, but as a separate independent state. This was then the force that we had, 13 colonies, Vermont. The French and the Spanish came into the war to assist us, and without them we wouldn't be a United States today. We weren't very good. We didn't have the money, we didn't have the equipment, didn't have the training, didn't have the places to train. And so sometimes when we talk about the need for help and having people working with us, right from our beginning, we wouldn't be where we are today if we hadn't had that, especially the French. It's an outline of the structure. The Navy was small, you think about it, but it was very, very important to our winning the war. And as we say here, they did a lot in the war to ensure that we came out victorious. We'll talk about that as well. So somehow something of the structure of the Navy during this time frame. Privateers were sort of like hired contractors, in that we hired an awful lot of people under contract to go out and operate as part of the Navy. And they were very effective in terms of taking ships and defeating them, even though they were not originally in the military per se, but they were hired as private contractors to do it. These were some of the losses that we experienced during the war. And then again, this is just an overall summary. Now remember what I've said is what I've tried to do is to just give you an overview of understanding the demographics, the finances, and so forth that were important in understanding the history of any group, in this case, the history of blacks in the military. You've got to start with this, and this is nothing more than a summary of it if you're going to get a full understanding of it. The second factor necessary to understand the history of blacks, I would contend, is understanding the fact that blacks continuously were rejected from participating in the military. Up until, I'll just say up until Truman's declaration in 1947. And that even integration of the military completely didn't occur until 1953. So we're talking from 1775 to 1953 in terms of this constant rejection of blacks in the military within the general public as a whole. And this happened every single time before every war as a framework of looking at it. Example of it. It's the opinion of the committee that the admission of any freedmen as soldiers into the army, now rising, would reflect dishonor on the colonies, and that no slaves be admitted into this army. General Washington instructing recruiters. You are not to enlist any deserter, nor any stroller, Negro, or vagabond, and it goes on. When Washington met with some of his leaders, they all agreed. No blacks in the military. When he met with the representatives of Congress, Continental Congress, the statement, no blacks in the military. You get the gist of what I'm saying here. If blacks were not wanted in the military, why would they want to join the military? Main goal, I would contend, over the last 243 years for blacks joining the military have been two. Over some other factors, but two main ones. Freedom, especially in those days. Remember, we're talking 500,000 people, most of whom are in slavery, or equality. And I would contend after slaves were freed, equality has become the main goal, over and above all of the other goals that one might have for joining the military. Economic, political, social. Third factor here. Manpower shortages and protests result over and over again in the reluctant acceptance of blacks into the military during this period. Remember, I've already shown you they didn't want blacks in the military. So how did blacks get into the military? Well, the number one reason every single time has been a shortage of manpower. no matter what period you look at. They get into the war, discover they don't have enough people, and what's the next thing that changes? Let's open it up. So all of a sudden, all those things that I mentioned before have changed. Now you can recruit. Same Washington here. I've given license for their being enlisted. If this is disapproved by the Congress, I'll put a stop to it, though. But he did go ahead and authorize it. Then the Congress comes on board. Not with slaves yet, but with free blacks. Remember we said that about 20%, I believe it was it 24%? A certain percentage that were free blacks at that time. The different colonies had problems reaching their manpower requirements. And so they had to come up with a way of getting people in. So no matter what the Continental Congress was saying, remember we said they didn't have much authority. I mean, they could come out with these laws and proposals and requirements, but they didn't have a way of enforcing them. So while they would say to a particular colony or a state, once it became a state, you must provide so many people, how do you force them to do it? And how does that colony come up with the people? There were more people of African descent in South Carolina than there were of European descent in this time frame. So when they're given, for example, in South Carolina, a total number of people that they must come up with, their only solution was to then go to free blacks and to slaves. Maryland. Georgia. The point here is that all of them broke down and all at once blacks are being enlisted into the service. Manpower shortage. Fourth recurring factor necessary in understanding the history of blacks in the military. Most blacks entering the military were placed in physical labor, dominant military jobs under white officers, and some were reluctantly placed in combat jobs, but also under white officers. And the reason for the white officers is because they believed that blacks didn't have the intelligence to be officers. The acceptance is coming to put them into the service, but put them into what areas? Labor areas. One of the interesting things about looking at this time period in terms of slavery is that often many slaves were brought into the military, but when they were brought into the military, the slave master was paid for their service in the military. They didn't receive anything. But they fought for the colonies, fought for the freedom, but they didn't receive anything for it. And many of them were never freed as a result of their service in the military, even though their masters got paid for it, for their being in it, because they were property. Another major use of blacks in the military in this time frame, accepted, was putting them as drummers and fifers, playing the fife and the drum as they march various places for various reasons, in addition to being laborers. I put this up to show what the results were. And this has occurred with every single war that we've been a part of. No matter what the reluctance has been to have blacks in the military, once they were in, they always demonstrated their courage and ability to fight and to do the best job possible in every field they were in, every single one. And these are just some of the examples of that. You might be also surprised that during the Revolutionary War, it was probably the most integrated military the United States had had all the way up until 1953, when the service became integrated. Because when they integrated blacks into those units, they were in such small numbers that they integrated them in with white soldiers. They actually slept in the same place, ate in the same place, went the same places. And that would not happen again after the Revolutionary War until 1953. 3 exceptions to that. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the Bucks of America Militia, and the 2nd Company of the 4th Connecticut Regiment. Those were all black units. But other than that, blacks were fully integrated into the service and during the Revolutionary War. One of the other interesting things to say, to remember about this war, is that the average time frame, like now, if you enter the Air Force, you're enlisted in the Air Force, it's what, 3 years, 4 years? 6 years, okay. 6 years if you enter the Air Force. Then it was 1 year if you entered the Army or the Navy that you were obligated for. And many didn't even stay the 1 year. Once they got into combat, saw what it was like, they just deserted. We didn't have anybody to go running around trying to find them either. So they often got away with it. But one group of people, because of that, even though they may have been smaller in number, ended up serving more time in the military during the Revolutionary War than those of European descent, those of African descent, with the average being 4.5 years. 8 times longer than the average period for white soldiers who served during the Revolutionary War. Remember these same people who they were reluctant to take in. This is what they had to say about them once they had taken them in and the war started. What was going on? Brave and gallant. Able-bodied, strong, and brave. Doesn't sound like the same people they were reluctant to take in the beginning. Alexander Hamilton, we've got the play going right now. He's very well known throughout our culture at the present time. Well, he was a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and this is what he had to say. Their natural faculties are as good as ours. The Negroes make hardy soldiers. Their faithfulness in doing fatigue duties or labor, their patient endurance of heat, cold, hunger, and thirst, and their bold efficiency in battle. They're equal to any troops in the army. Big difference, again, from the beginning. Impact of blacks in the military from that Revolutionary War. These are the dates when those particular colonies freed blacks in their particular states at this time. Now, I also have to mention that in most of those cases, they were gradual freedoms. By that I mean that even though they said the slaves were freed, it wasn't an automatic you're free today. It was like when you get to be 20-something years old or some other stipulation that was attached to it that had to be reached before one was free. By 1804, all northern states had voted to abolish the institution of slavery. And again, as I just mentioned, even though they had abolished it, you could still find slavery in these states up until the Civil War, even though the law said no slavery. My fifth recurring factor to consider when you're looking at blacks in the military. Once the war was over, who's the first to go? Blacks in the military. Consistent, no matter which war you look at. Consistent. First ones let out. Even if they want to stay. And again, until we point this out, it's pretty much the same up until the War of 1812. And once they're out, no more enlisting. Why? Going back to these fears, rebellion, won't fight. Just got through fighting, won't fight, stereotypes. Maybe it's been a little unusual in this history because especially in the beginning, they needed manpower so badly and they found that blacks made the best manpower for them in terms of what they were required to do. So even when they were told you're not supposed to enlist blacks, they often did. As my wife was telling me, I've only got a few more minutes here, and I haven't even started. Sixth recurring factor. When the next war started, guess what happened? The cycle starts all over again. So when you're, essentially what I'm saying here is when you look at this, and you look at each one of these wars, what you find is the same thing I've just gone over. Initially, don't want you in. Manpower shortage, we need you in. We're going to put you in the labor-intensive units first. Then you prove that you can in fact be good fighters, which every time they did in every war. And get all kind of praise for it. As soon as the war is over, out. No more enlisting. And then when the next war starts, what? Same cycle over again. Now, I could go through each one of the wars and show you exactly how that takes place. Now, what I was going to do before I just got alerted that my time is running short is to show you some examples from each one of those. And I'll scan it as quickly as I can, and hopefully I'll make the point. Okay. Before I do this, let me just ask this question. How many wars, I want you to think for just a minute, think to yourself and count to yourself. How many wars has the United States been involved in since 1775? Just count to yourself based on your textbook lessons from college and so forth, and high school. How many wars have we been in since 1775? 7. And these wars, conflicts, how many have we been in? I heard 8 wars. 8. Those are the ones this way. No. This is what I normally get.
Oh, that's the most common number.
That's the most common number. This is the direct number. 90. 90. And to give you a example of those from the 19th century. From the 20th century. And the 21st century that we're in now. And guess who's been involved in all of those? Now this is what I was going to attempt to do, but I'm not going to be able to go through it in the same way, so I'm just going to scan very quickly through it and just show that what I was going to try to do is to show how in the 19th and 20th century, just using one example from those, of how we went through the same cycle over and over again. I challenge you to do that if you want to know more about the history of blacks in the military. War of 1812. Looked at the population. What was our goal here? Primary objective we had? Take Canada. And again, when we go into these wars, we often think that when we read the textbook that everybody is for the war. And anyone who's lived through these know that's not the case. As you can just think of your own situation today. Everybody for the wars that we're in right now? Or do we have just people in the country who are not necessarily for it? That's existed forever. So there wasn't a consensus of these wars that we should in fact be in them. Now this should tell you what the next thing is. If in fact the authorized spends for 35,000 for the Army, we had 11,000, guess who they're going to now allow to come in? Who? Blacks. We had the same thing here. All at once those states are now authorizing enlistment of blacks. It said no blacks before. And we're back to what kind of jobs do we give them initially when they go in. And yet, they end up in the battles, and they end up doing outstanding work. Everyone. And the statements that we normally get after each one. What? What is that? 9 o'clock?
At 6 o'clock, I mean, at 8 o'clock or something, and I'm going to start everything. Yeah. Shut down. Yay, later.
We're back to excluding again. And again, even though the Navy needed people, they were forced to put in quotas. And when the next war began, what did we do? Back into the cycle. For example, in the 20th century, I was going to use World War II. Begin to see where I'm going. I don't think I need to go through all of these again, but I'll go as fast as I can here. Looking at the structure, rejection. Roosevelt continued those same policies. some about the Air Force. At the beginning of it, just keep the airmen and stuff like that. That's quite a bit of that. In 1939, Congress passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act to create a pool of trained pilots. Now, this wasn't necessarily for blacks, though, because they didn't think blacks were intelligent enough to be pilots, to fly. But there was quite a bit of, let's see. This slide, I'll come back to that. This slide was to try to show how this guy was the only black general in World War II, during World War II. First and only black general. He was only a general of the black troops. A white private did not have to salute him or take any orders from him. Only the black troops. He did make an inspector's trip around to several of the posts, and his report to the Department of Defense showed some of the situations that he found at these various posts, like Fort Bragg, Alexandria, Louisiana, Fort Dix, and so forth. And it wasn't very good in terms of how the black soldiers were being treated in those particular areas. My father was in World War II, and my wife's father was in World War II. And how my time's gone.
Let's wait till Sam has his go.
My wife's father wanted me to write a little book for his, or give his grandkids something to remember him about, because he was up in his 90s when he started to have a lot of grandkids. And he knew that they would never get to know him. So I wrote this little book, did several interviews with him, and I wrote this little book about him. And I passed it out to all of his grandkids. And one of the chapters deals with his experiences in World War II, from my interviews with him. And I was going to share some of that with you from that book in terms of his experiences and how he shared those with me in that part of the book. Unfortunately, I won't do that because it does take a little bit more time.
Do they have copies of that here?
Probably not. I just did it for his grandkids. But if Joe wants one, we can get you one. Okay. The Civilian Pilot Training Act, though, created a pool of trained aviators for the war. First, blacks were excluded from it. There were a lot of protests from organizations like the NAACP and others to include blacks, so they, in fact, opened it up to some of the historically black colleges. And I wanted to cover a little bit of that in here. This was a report, I'll get to this in a second, but this was a report that sort of guided the military into World War II in terms of their thinking. The use of Negro manpower said black soldiers lacked the necessary courage, intelligence, and ability to fly military planes. And it illustrates this. These two individuals were very important, and I'm going to make it local here. These two individuals were very important in terms of getting one of those training programs. They were connected to a local college. Anybody know the name? West Virginia State. West Virginia State. I've got it up here, though. Gave it away. In fact, when they debated as to who would get the limited number of, they had approved seven. Seven of the historically black colleges would get an aviation training program. And so all of the historically black colleges had to compete for that training program. Guess which college was the first one awarded the program? West Virginia State. West Virginia State. These are some of the reasons it was the first to get that. They had an airfield right next to the campus. The Charleston or Kanawha Valley Airport was located right next to West Virginia State. That helped in the application. They had an individual on campus who was a trained pilot. He was one of the first blacks to get an authorized pilot's license in the United States. And he happened to teach in the music department. But he also had his pilot's license. And the only reason he got it was because his wife's brother was a trained pilot. And he wanted to impress his wife. So he went out and took lessons and was able to get his license as a pilot. So this was another plus for West Virginia State because they had somebody already on the campus who could provide the training to others. These were some of the politicians who were also very supportive of West Virginia State College, and they went to bat for it as well. So given all of that support they had, they were in fact the first of the 7 HBCUs that got a training program to train pilots in the service. These were some of the people, and you might note that women were also included. And in fact, this lady right here became one of the trainers when she became trained in Adolph as a pilot, to be a pilot. She went down to Tuskegee to try to become one of the Tuskegee Airmen, but they wouldn't let her in. This is her right here again. But she became one of the trainers as well for the program. These were the 6 colleges that were selected. The next question is, how do they get into the military then? And that leads to the creation of the Tuskegee Airmen and so forth. One of the interesting things is that each one of those 6 schools were required to send 2 people who had gone through their training program to Tuskegee for training to become pilots, each one of the 6 schools. Out of those that went, only 5 completed the training and became pilots, the first pilots in the United States Army. These were the 5. Now the other most interesting thing is both of the 2 that came from West Virginia State finished. And here they are, right here. And this guy right here. This guy became the 2nd highest ranking guy in the Tuskegee Airmen, by the way. Only to this one right here. We can talk about him all day. Their names are here. Davis is right here. He was already in service. He graduated from the military academy. And he was the only black in the academy, graduated from the military academy in 1933, I believe it was. Only black in the academy, only one, and graduated in 1933. Went through 4 years in the military academy, and nobody talked to him. None of his classmates would even talk to him. And the only, yeah. This is 1933. His father was the one that I mentioned earlier, who was the first black general. And he became the 2nd black general in the military. The son did. These are just some of the people who graduated from West Virginia State, went through their program. I think there were a total of about 35, if I recall, who ended up in the Tuskegee Airmen units during the war. Here's some of the names. This is the guy I mentioned before, one of those 2 individuals from West Virginia State. This is him when he went in, and this is him when he retired.
That's PG.
This is some of their accomplishments. You're all familiar with the West Virginia, with the Tuskegee Airmen. Again, you can imagine then, we're back to the praise again of the work of those who were in the military. This is just the executive order that Truman put out that integrated the military. One of the other points we mentioned, because this deals with the officer side, where in fact they had resisted having blacks as officers throughout the history of the military. Even though blacks could enlist, most were enlisted. Very few served as officers in the military up to this point. They created 4-year ROTC programs at historic land-grant colleges. They had ROTC programs, but not 4-year programs where you could get a commission as an officer. In 1942, they changed that, and they created the land grant, in the land grant schools, these ROTC programs where you could in fact then become an officer upon graduating. Guess which school was the first one to get one of those programs? West Virginia State. We have the West Virginia State graduates in here? All right. This is that first group on the campus of West Virginia State. And it produced a lot of great officers from that program at all ranks. But one of the interesting things about the college is that it had in fact produced 15 general officers. For a small school, that's just unbelievable. Considering the fact as well that you don't get the first blacks becoming officers in any numbers until the late 1960s. And any numbers until the 1980s. At one time, and I haven't kept up with it, at one time West Virginia State had produced more officers from its program than any other college in the United States. I don't know whether it's still so. Here are the black officers, black generals, I'm sorry, that are made general. And here, as these are 11, black, and here are the other 4 to make up the 15. Now, I wasn't sure whether General Hoyer was going to be here or not, but I was going to brag if he was, because General Hoyer was one of my students in ROTC. And now he is, in fact, the top general in the state of West Virginia. And he is a graduate of that ROTC program. So tell him I bragged about it. Also, I found it very sad that often most people have never heard of this guy. I can tell some stories about some of the calls I've gotten inquiring about it, but they've never heard of it. Major General Charles Rogers from Fairmont, West Virginia, Medal of Honor winner in Vietnam. And he's one of those generals. If you look at the current Army, you get a feel for the strength of the Army. Military, I'm sorry. How it breaks down by enlisted officers. In terms of the percent of blacks on active duty now, we're talking. Now remember, in the black population of the United States is only about 12, 13%. Am I right? Somewhere in that neighborhood? 24%? 19%? In each one of these, the percent of African Americans in the military, in those different branches, exceeds the number of African Americans in the population, except for the Marine Corps. So are blacks performing their civil duties and so forth? These are a lot of firsts that we have. I'm just going to run through these. These are, if you look at the Army staff today, this is out of the 2018-2019 Green Book, they call it. I can tell you some stories about the things in the Green Book too as well. But as you can see, there are also black generals now on the top staffs of the United States Army, for example. Have we made progress? Absolutely. 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 one of the top commanders in the whole United States Army right here. 4-star. This guy provides all of the infantry training for everybody who goes into the army. He's the guy in charge of all of that training. This one I thought would probably scare a lot of people in our country if they knew this. It's no longer the case, but this guy right here, for about 6 years, and he just gave it up maybe a year or two ago, was in fact in charge of all of the nuclear weapons that the United States controls. Every single one. He was the guy responsible.
I remember when he was a captain.
Oh, did you?
I do.
Okay. Well, he did all right.
Yeah, he did.
And this guy was responsible for all of the Air Force nuclear bombers. Yeah. Yeah. These are just pictures, just again show that we've been involved in every single one of those 90 wars, conflicts that we've had. Well, I went over my time. I apologize. Any questions that I can answer? Do I have time for questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a comment. Coming from Lewisburg, I got this information that there was, during the Revolutionary War, there was a black man who was an indentured servant who fought off the British in a cabin. It was insurmountable circumstances, and his rifle is in the Culture Center in the museum, and his name was Dick Pointer. They have a monument in Lewisburg in honor of Dick Pointer. Just want to pass it.
And I might add, in terms of the progress, this is a book that was put out in 1990-something. I don't remember the exact date on it. To show the progress, these have pictures of all of the black generals, admirals in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and so forth in that time frame. And there have been more, of course, since then. So you can see if, in fact, the first black general really in the integrated force didn't come until about 1968, we've made a lot of progress. If, in fact, they can put out a book this thick with a lot of pictures on one page of black generals and admirals in the Navy and the Air Force. The Armed Forces are probably the most integrated institution in our whole society, I would contend. Any other questions? Well, I thank you very much for coming. I hope you learned something from it. I'm sorry for having to rush through it, but as I said from the very beginning, I don't know how to cover 243 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ledbetter, and thank you to all of you for being a part of our Black History Lecture Series this year. I want to thank the AARP. They have provided tonight's reception for you. That's going to happen outside in the lecture hall, in the Great Hall. I'd also like to thank Dr. Randall Reed Smith of the Department of Arts, Culture, and History for allowing us to have the event here. And I would like to also invite you to follow us on Twitter. It is at WVHHOMA, and the same thing on Facebook, at WVHHOMA, and our website is minorityAffairs.wv.gov. Thanks again for being here. Good night.